The kitchen smelled of roasted meat and overcooked vegetables, the air thick and heavy as if it were pressing down on my chest. My hands were wet from scrubbing pans in the sink, my back aching from hours of bending over counters, and I could feel a slow pulse of pain building in my side every time I twisted to reach for something. Richard's voice cut through the clatter like a whip, sharp and full of command. "Shut up!" It was not just the words, but the way they landed, heavy and dismissive, as if any sound I made was an insult to the order he demanded. The pain that had been pulsing suddenly sharpened, shooting through my ribs like a knife, and for a moment I thought the room had tilted. Samantha's laugh came next, light but cruel, filling the space between the pounding in my head and the ache in my chest. Look at her acting again. I gripped the edge of the counter, willing my knees not to give way. The dish towel slipped from my hands, falling soundlessly to the floor, though I could hear my own breathing grow louder and shorter in my ears. Richard stood close enough that I could see the faint smear of grease on his shirt, the smell of it mixing with the metallic tang rising in my throat. He was watching me with that look he had used my entire life, the one that dared me to show weakness so he could stamp it out. The pressure around my ribs tightened as if a band were being drawn tighter and tighter with each breath. Samantha leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, a satisfied smirk pulling at her mouth. She was enjoying this, the spectacle of me trying to keep my body from folding in half. The pain surged again, hotter this time, and I bit back the sound that threatened to escape because I knew it would only feed them. My vision wavered at the edges, blurring the shape of the kitchen table and the chairs around it. I focused on the grain of the countertop, tracing it with my eyes to keep from tipping forward. Somewhere outside the front door, I heard the crunch of tires on frozen gravel. The sound should have been ordinary, but in that moment it was like a flare in the dark. Samantha's laugh rose again as I reached for a glass of water and missed my fingers, numb and clumsy. The pain no longer pulsed. It had settled into a constant throb that made it hard to think, let alone move. Richard's shadow fell across me, and he told me to get back to work, as if the wetness in my eyes were nothing more than laziness. The front door opened, and cold air spilled in, making the heat of the kitchen feel suddenly suffocating. Dr. Howard stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room in a quick sweep before settling on me. His expression shifted in an instant from neighborly politeness to something harder, more urgent. "What happened here?" Richard started to answer, but Dr. Howard was already crossing the room. His gaze locked on the way I was holding my side, the shallow rise and fall of my chest. "You need to sit down right now." I opened my mouth to say I was fine, because that was what years in this house had taught me to do, but the words stuck behind the pain that made every breath a calculation. I grew up in a house where silence was treated as strength and pain was treated as weakness. A two-story structure in a small Midwestern town that felt more like a training ground than a home. Richard Marshall. My father ran it with the same rigid control he brought to his construction business, barking orders, setting strict schedules, and expecting every command to be carried out without question. He was a tall man with hands permanently rough from years of labor and a voice that could cut through any conversation. My mother, Sarah, had been the only soft place in that house, but she died suddenly when I was 7, leaving Richard to raise me and my older sister Samantha alone. Her absence was a hole that never closed, and instead of filling it with comfort, my father filled it with discipline. Samantha flourished under his approval. She was the golden child, the perfect daughter who never seemed to falter in his eyes, always smiling in public, always speaking the right words to please him. I was the opposite, quieter, more sensitive, quick to feel when something was wrong and quick to show it. In Richard's world, that made me defective. The first time I broke a bone, falling from the low branch of an oak tree in our yard, he made me wash and dry the dinner dishes before agreeing to take me to urgent care. He told the doctor I was probably exaggerating, and I remember the flush of embarrassment when the X-ray proved the fracture was real. That pattern never changed. Every illness, every injury was questioned, minimized, or dismissed entirely. Samantha learned early to side with him. She would roll her eyes when I mentioned a headache, smirk when I limped, laugh when I coughed. To them, my discomfort was a performance. Without my mother there to counterbalance his harshness, I grew used to the constant criticism. Richard's way of showing affection was to offer me extra chores, telling me it was for my own good. Samantha was allowed to pursue dance lessons and weekend trips with friends, while I stayed home to clean gutters or repaint the fence. The unspoken rule was that I had to earn my place in that house, and even then, it was never secure. My only real refuge was the voice of my Aunt Karen, my mother's younger sister who lived 3 states away and called every few weeks. She never sugarcoated what she thought of Richard's methods, and more than once she told me to get out as soon as I could. I clung to those calls like lifelines, storing her words for the nights when the walls of my room felt too close. When I was 16, a bad flu kept me in bed for 3 days, fever-breaking and returning my stomach unable to hold food. Richard insisted I get up and help shovel snow from the driveway. Samantha stood at the window sipping cocoa and told him she could do it instead. He waved her off, saying I needed to toughen up. I shoveled until the edges of my vision went gray, the cold air burning my throat and lungs. And when I finally collapsed against the snowbank, he accused me of being dramatic. By then, I had stopped protesting. Every objection only made things worse. I learned to swallow my words to hide the pain, to nod when he gave orders no matter how unreasonable. I thought leaving for college would erase those years that distance would make me someone new, and for a while, it did. 4 years away in the city taught me what it was like to be taken at my word, to have friends who believed me when I said I was tired or unwell to be granted understanding instead of suspicion. But the past had a way of pulling me back, and when the job I counted on vanished and my savings ran dry, there was nowhere else to go but the apartment above the garage behind my father's house, the same garage I had scrubbed clean as punishment one summer. It was meant to be temporary, a stopgap until I found work. Richard welcomed me back with the kind of smile that made me uneasy, and Samantha looked me over like she was measuring how quickly she could remind me of my place. The walls were closing in again, and I could feel the old rules settling back over me as heavy as the winter sky. The first few weeks back in my hometown moved slowly each day, blending into the next under the weight of my father's rules. Richard wasted no time re-establishing his authority, setting a daily schedule that began at 5 in the morning with chores and ended late in the evening after dinner cleanup. Anytime I wasn't actively looking for work, he filled with tasks he claimed were for my benefit, from clearing out the attic to scrubbing the oil stains from the garage floor. Samantha, now living in a townhouse across town but visiting daily, seized every opportunity to assign me the heaviest, most inconvenient jobs under the guise of helping our father. It was clear she enjoyed the sight of me carrying loads that made my arms ache or stretching to reach shelves that strained my back. She always seemed to appear at just the right moment to watch me struggle, her lips curling in the same smirk I had known since childhood. I had no car of my own, so leaving the property required either walking several miles in the biting wind or asking permission to borrow an old truck that Richard controlled the keys to. My phone was another point of control. He made comments about checking it to ensure I wasn't wasting time, and though he didn't actually hold it hostage, the implication was clear. My privacy was conditional. On a particularly cold morning, I woke with a pounding headache and a stiffness in my shoulders that made it difficult to turn my head. I knew the signs of an oncoming fever, but when I mentioned it at breakfast, Richard didn't even look up from his coffee. "Stop faking it. We have work to do." Samantha glanced at me with a spark of amusement in her eyes and slid the basket of laundry toward my end of the table. "Dad wants this folded before noon." I spent the morning moving slowly, the ache in my body growing heavier with each trip up and down the stairs. By midday, I was lightheaded and had to grip the banister to keep from swaying. Samantha noticed, of course, and called out, careful to make her voice carry to the kitchen, where our father sat reading the paper. "You should see her. She looks ready to drop the laundry just to get out of helping." Richard's voice cut back with casual finality. "Then she better finish fast." Over the next week, the tension in the house thickened. I found myself more on edge with each passing day, knowing that one wrong move or one slip of my patience could lead to another explosion. I avoided speaking unless spoken to, kept my eyes down during meals, and focused on sending out job applications late at night when the house was quiet. Aunt Karen called once during that stretch, her voice warm but threaded with worry. I told her I was fine, omitting the details of the constant criticism and endless demands. She didn't believe me, I could hear it in her sigh, but she didn't push. She reminded me that her door was always open, that I didn't have to stay in a place where my worth was measured by how much work I could endure without complaint. Her words stayed with me even as I folded them away behind the mental wall I had built to get through each day. When Samantha invited me to help her pick out decorations for a party she was hosting, I thought maybe it was a peace offering, but it turned out she just needed someone to carry the boxes and hold her coffee while she browsed. My life had shrunk to these small humiliations, each one a reminder of how quickly I had fallen back into the role they had written for me years ago. It was as though my time away had been an illusion, a brief intermission before the same play resumed with the same cast and the same lines, and I was once again the character no one believed. The day that would set everything in motion began without warning. Just another morning wrapped in gray clouds and the damp chill of early spring. I woke to the sound of Samantha's voice drifting up from the kitchen, her tone bright in a way that always meant she was planning something that would involve me. When I came down, Richard was already at the table with a mug of coffee, a notebook open in front of him. Without looking up, he announced that the family would be hosting a dinner for Margaret's 82nd birthday in 2 weeks, and that it was my responsibility to handle the menu, the cooking, and the house preparation. Samantha grinned over her phone and added that she would help, which in her language meant she would supervise and criticize. I nodded, knowing that refusal wasn't an option, but inside I felt the familiar knot tighten in my stomach. For days, the preparations consumed me. I made lists, shopped for groceries, scrubbed every corner of the house until my hands were raw. Richard monitored my progress like a foreman inspecting a job site, making comments about dust on the baseboards or streaks on the windows. Samantha popped in periodically to point out what I'd missed, usually with an exaggerated sigh. The tension was constant, but I told myself if I just got through the dinner without a misstep, maybe things would ease. A few days before the event, I noticed a strange ache in my side after lifting a box of serving dishes from the basement. At first, it was just a twinge, but by the next morning, it had spread into a tightness that made deep breaths uncomfortable. I didn't say anything, remembering too clearly the last time I'd mentioned feeling unwell. Instead, I pushed through, telling myself it was probably just a pulled muscle. Each day, the pain grew sharper, and by the eve of the dinner, I was moving slower, wincing when I bent over or reached too high. Samantha noticed, of course, and made a show of laughing at my dramatic expressions, telling Richard that I was acting like I'd been in a car crash. He didn't bother to look up from his paper when he told me to stop exaggerating and finish setting the dining room. On the morning of the celebration, the house buzzed with activity. I woke early to start roasting the meats and preparing side dishes. Every step sent a dull throb through my ribs, but I kept moving, determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing me falter. Around noon, while lifting a tray from the oven, the pain spiked so sharply I had to set it down before my hands gave out. Samantha, standing nearby, rolled her eyes and told me to save the theatrics for after the guests leave. By mid-afternoon, the ache had settled into a steady burn, and even breathing felt like work. I thought about calling Aunt Karen, but what could she do from 3 states away? Guests began arriving as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the backyard. The smell of roasted vegetables and fresh bread filled the air, mingling with the sound of polite conversation. Richard played host, shaking hands and laughing loudly while I stayed in the kitchen arranging platters and forcing myself to ignore the waves of discomfort. Samantha flitted between rooms, her voice carrying over the din, always finding a way to mention how much help she'd given. I kept my head down, knowing that if I could just make it through the evening, I could rest tomorrow. But the thought kept circling in my mind like a warning bell. Something was not right, and the longer I ignored it, the worse it would get. By the time the last dish was in the oven and the table was set with Margaret's favorite china, my body felt like it was moving through thick syrup. The dining room glowed under the warm light of the chandelier, but to me, the brightness was almost painful, forcing me to squint as I carried pitchers of water and bowls of salad from the kitchen. Every trip sent a jolt through my ribs, the pain, now so familiar, it had become a rhythm I dreaded. Samantha hovered in the doorway, making small remarks about the arrangement of the silverware, or the way I'd folded the napkins, her voice carrying just enough to reach Richard in the next room. He would call out occasional corrections, never getting up himself, as if reminding me of his authority, without having to leave his chair. Guests trickled in, bringing with them the smell of perfume and cold air. Laughter filled the house, the kind that floats easily from people who have no idea what's happening behind closed doors. Margaret arrived last, walking slowly with her cane, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She smiled at me, brief but genuine, before Samantha whisked her away to a seat of honor at the head of the table. I stayed in the kitchen stirring gravy and basting the roast, trying to keep my breathing steady. Each inhale felt shallower than the last, as if my chest couldn't expand enough to fill my lungs. When it was finally time to serve, I moved with deliberate care, placing plates in front of guests and forcing my lips into a smile that felt brittle. Samantha took every opportunity to reach across me or bump my arm, her smirk widening each time I wobbled. Richard sat near the middle of the table, telling stories about his work, soaking in the attention of the crowd. Between courses, I ducked into the pantry to catch my breath, leaning against the cool wall for support. The throbbing in my ribs had merged with a sharp stab that flared whenever I bent or twisted. I thought of telling someone, maybe Margaret, but the image of Richard's dismissive glare stopped me cold. Back at the table, the conversations rolled on without me, forks clinking against plates, glasses clinking in toasts. I kept moving, clearing dishes, refilling drinks, each step heavier than the last. Samantha's voice floated behind me, telling someone that I always found a way to get out of the hard work, that I had been like this since we were kids. The laughter that followed made my ears burn. I was carrying a platter of dessert when it happened. A sudden, searing pain tore through my side so strong I nearly dropped the dish. My knees buckled and I had to grip the back of a chair to keep from collapsing. The room seemed to narrow, the voices blurring into an indistinct hum. Samantha's laughter rang out sharp and clear over the noise, and she called to Richard, saying I was putting on a show again. He turned just enough to glance at me, then waved his hand toward the kitchen, telling me to pull myself together. I straightened, forcing my legs to move, but each step felt like it might be the one that sent me crashing to the floor. I told myself I just needed to make it through dessert, but deep down I knew I was already past the point of pretending. I was halfway to the kitchen when my foot caught on the edge of the rug, and the sudden jolt sent a fresh wave of agony through my ribs. My vision flared white for a second, and I froze, gripping the counter until the spinning eased. The smell of the roast still lingered in the warm air, but it had turned from comforting to nauseating. I set the dessert platter down harder than I meant to, the plates rattling against each other, and leaned forward to brace myself. Samantha appeared in the doorway, her eyebrows arched, as if I had just interrupted a performance she was enjoying. "You look like you are about to faint," she said with that mocking sweetness she used when she wanted an audience. "Maybe you should lie down so we can all talk about how lazy you are." Her words hit me with the same force as the pain in my chest, but before I could answer, Richard stepped in behind her, his voice already rising. "Quit dragging your feet. There is still cleanup to do." He moved closer, towering over me, and the heat of his presence was suffocating. I opened my mouth to tell him I needed to sit, but another sharp stab cut through my side, stealing the breath from my lungs. I hunched instinctively, and that was all it took for him to snap. "Straighten up. You look pathetic." His hand shot out, shoving at my shoulder to force me upright. The movement sent a bolt of pain ripping through my torso, and I gasped before I could stop myself. Samantha's laugh burst out again, bright and cruel, and I heard her say something about me auditioning for sympathy. My knees wobbled. I stepped back, but my hip caught the edge of the counter, sending another flare through my side. I clutched the countertop to keep from sliding to the floor, my breath now coming in shallow, panicked pulls. The sound of conversation from the dining room dimmed as I focused on the simple act of keeping air moving in and out. I was distantly aware of footsteps behind me, heavier than Samantha's heels, and then a new voice cut through the haze. "Is she all right?" I blinked and saw Dr. Howard standing in the doorway. His eyes narrowed as they swept over my hunched posture, my hand gripping my side. "I am fine," I tried to say, but the words came out thin and broken. He ignored my protest and stepped forward, brushing past Samantha. "When did this start?" I shook my head, unwilling to give him the truth in front of Richard. "Her breathing is off," Dr. Howard said, his voice shifting into the steady tone of someone used to taking charge. "This is not normal. Call for an ambulance." Richard's immediate bark of "no" startled the room, but Dr. Howard didn't flinch. "Now." The authority in his voice was different from my father's firm, without cruelty, and it silenced even Samantha. I felt a strange mix of fear and relief, the room tilting again as the strength left my legs. Dr. Howard's hand was on my arm, steadying me, and he spoke low enough for only me to hear. "You are not fine. We are getting you help." For the first time that night, I believed someone. The room around me blurred into fragments of movement and sound as Dr. Howard eased me toward a chair, his arm firm but careful against my back. Samantha stepped aside, her smirk faltering as she watched him pull a small flashlight from his pocket and check my pupils. I could feel Richard's eyes on us, the tension in the air sharp enough to cut through. "She's overreacting," he said, his voice edged with the same irritation he used when a worker missed a deadline. "She's fine." Dr. Howard didn't look up. Her pulse is racing and her breathing is shallow. This could be serious. "Call 911. I heard a shuffle of feet and the murmur of voices from the dining room as a few guests drifted closer, curiosity drawing them in. Richard straightened, squaring his shoulders like he was facing down an opponent, but the doctor's calm certainty left no room for argument. Samantha glanced between them, then turned toward the guests with a shrug, as if to say she had warned them about my supposed dramatics. My focus narrowed to the pressure in my chest and the heat radiating from the spot where the pain was worst. The minutes stretched as we waited, each breath a measured effort. I felt the cold air first, then the rush of footsteps as 2 EMTs entered their equipment bags, swinging from their hands. One knelt beside me immediately, clipping a sensor to my finger, the small beeping sound loud in the quiet room. "Her oxygen is low," one of them said, glancing at Dr. Howard. He nodded once. "Possible fracture risk of internal injury. Let's move her carefully." They began asking questions, their voices brisk but not unkind, and for each one I managed a short answer. I could see Richard in the background, his face pale, but still locked in that stubborn set I knew so well. Samantha hung back her arms crossed, avoiding my gaze. The EMTs worked quickly, fitting a supportive wrap around my torso before helping me to my feet. The moment I stood, the dizziness surged and I swayed, their hands steadying me. "We need to get her to the ER now," one of them said, already guiding me toward the door. Outside, the night air was crisp, and I could hear the low murmur of guests on the porch, their eyes following us as we moved. The ambulance door opened, and I was helped inside, the interior bright and sterile, smelling faintly of antiseptic. One EMT began securing the straps across my chest and legs, while the other placed an oxygen mask over my face. The rush of cool air into my lungs was immediate, a relief so intense I closed my eyes. Dr. Howard appeared in the doorway for a moment, his voice low. "I'll call your aunt." I nodded faintly, the mask shifting slightly with the movement. The doors shut, sealing me in with the hum of the engine and the rhythmic beeping of the monitor. As the ambulance pulled away, I caught one last glimpse through the back window of Richard standing on the porch, his hands clenched at his sides, the porch light casting his shadow long and thin against the house. For the first time in years, he wasn't in control. The ambulance ride was a blur of light and sound, the siren's wail stretching and folding into itself as if time had come loose from its usual shape. The EMT seated to my right kept a steady hand on my shoulder, speaking to me in short, calm sentences, asking if the pain was getting worse, if I could breathe a little easier with the mask in place. I nodded when I could, though every movement sent a ripple of discomfort through my ribs. Across from me, the second EMT called ahead to the hospital, his voice efficient and precise as he relayed my vitals. Suspected rib fractures, possible internal bleeding, oxygen saturation improving with supplemental O2 patient alert, but invisible distress. The words felt detached from me as though they belonged to someone else. I thought of Aunt Karen, of how her voice might sound when Dr. Howard told her what had happened, and of how quickly she would get on the road despite the distance. The city lights smeared across the windows, blinking past in uneven intervals until the ambulance slowed and the bright bay doors of the emergency department opened ahead. The back doors swung wide and the cold hit me again, sharper this time, followed by the rush of voices and footsteps as I was wheeled inside. Fluorescent lights tracked overhead, each one passing like a beat in a drum line, until we stopped in a curtained bay where a nurse in blue scrubs took over. Blood pressure is low, heart rate elevated, she called to someone unseen. Another nurse was already fitting a cuff around my arm, sliding a thermometer under my tongue, her face close enough for me to see the faint freckles across her nose. A doctor appeared, introducing herself as Dr. Simmons, her tone brisk but warm. "We are going to order imaging right away to check for fractures and any internal injury. Can you tell me exactly where the pain is worst?" I pointed to my left side just beneath the ribs, and she pressed there gently, her touch sending a sharp burst through my chest that made me gasp. She nodded as if that confirmed what she suspected. "We will start with X-rays and possibly a CT scan." The next half hour moved in a series of small jolts, being lifted from the gurney to the imaging table, the machine's cold surface against my back, the technician's instructions to hold my breath while the scan captured its slices of me. Back in the bay, the beeping of monitors and the low murmur of voices became a strange kind of background hum. Dr. Simmons returned with the images showing me the clean white lines of bone interrupted by two thin breaks and the shadowy bloom of pooled blood near my lung. "You have 2 fractured ribs and a small hemothorax," she explained. "We will admit you for monitoring and pain management." Relief and fear twisted together in my chest. Finally, there was proof, something undeniable, but it came with the knowledge that I would be staying here under fluorescent lights, away from my bed, my door locked not by choice, but by hospital policy. As they prepared to move me upstairs, I heard a familiar voice in the hallway, urgent and close. Aunt Karen, her words quick as she insisted on being let through. And just like that, I knew I wasn't facing this night alone. Aunt Karen stepped through the curtain with the kind of energy that seemed to pull the air along with her, her coat still on, cheeks flushed from the cold and the rush to get here. The nurse glanced at me for permission, and I nodded quickly, already feeling the knot in my chest loosen just from seeing her. She crossed to my bedside in 2 strides and took my hand, her eyes scanning my face, my posture, the oxygen tubing, as if she were cataloging every detail to store for later. "What happened?" I opened my mouth to answer, but hesitated, glancing toward the doorway where I half expected Richard or Samantha to appear. Aunt Karen caught the flicker in my eyes, and her mouth tightened. "Who did this?" Her voice was low, but it carried weight, and I knew she already had a good idea. I told her in pieces, starting with the dinner preparations, the ache in my side, the shove, Samantha's laughter, and finally Dr. Howard stepping in. She didn't interrupt, but the muscle in her jaw worked with each word. When I finished, she squeezed my hand and said, "You're not going back there." It wasn't a suggestion. Dr. Simmons returned to check my vitals and update Karen on the treatment plan, explaining that I would need at least a few days of rest pain control and monitoring for any change in the blood pooling near my lung. Karen listened with the same focus she had given me, asking precise questions about recovery time and mobility. Once the doctor left, she leaned closer and said, "You realize this isn't just about getting better physically. We need to make sure they can't twist this into something it wasn't." Her words landed with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself yet. I'd been so focused on enduring, on getting through each day under their roof, that I hadn't thought about how they might rewrite the story if given the chance. The thought made my stomach clench. Karen outlined the steps before I could even respond. "We get the medical records, the EMT report, and Dr. Howard's statement. We make sure there's no room for doubt." Her decisiveness was like oxygen, giving me something to hold on to beyond the pain and fatigue. That night, after she left to get some rest at a nearby motel, I lay in the narrow hospital bed listening to the soft hum of the machines. The weight of the blanket felt grounding, the steady beep of the monitor, a reminder that my body was still working despite the damage. In the quiet, I let myself imagine the possibility of being free from Richard's control, of walking into a room without bracing for an attack, of hearing Samantha's voice without that familiar edge of cruelty. The image was fragile, but it was there, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like it might be something I could reach. I drifted into sleep with the thought that maybe, just maybe, this injury could be the crack in the wall they had built around me, the opening I needed to finally step through. The next morning, sunlight leaked in around the edges of the blinds, casting thin bars across the foot of my bed, and for a moment I forgot where I was until the antiseptic scent and the low murmur of voices in the hallway pulled me back. A nurse came in to check my vitals and help me sit up a little, the movement making my ribs protest with a sharp pull that stole my breath for a second. She told me Dr. Simmons would be in soon with an update, and not long after, Karen appeared again, looking more composed, but no less determined. She set her bag down on the chair and pulled out a slim folder. "I have the EMT report," she said, flipping it open so I could see the printed lines describing my condition upon pickup, the visible bruising, and my statement about being shoved. It was stark unemotional, but it was proof. Then she handed me her phone screen lit with a text thread from Dr. Howard, confirming he would write a statement and was willing to testify if needed. The mix of gratitude and disbelief made my throat tighten. I had spent years thinking no one would ever stand between me and Richard's control. Yet, here were two people doing exactly that. Dr. Simmons entered and explained that my oxygen levels were improving. The bleeding in my lungs seemed stable, and if things stayed steady, I might be discharged in a couple of days. She added that I would need follow-up care and should avoid any physical strain. Karen asked pointed questions about what activities were safe and what warning signs to watch for jotting everything down in a neat hand. After the doctor left, Karen leaned in and said, "We're not waiting until you're home to act. We'll file a police report before you're discharged." My instinct was to protest, to say it would make everything worse, but the words caught in my throat because I knew the truth. There was no worse left. It had already crossed every line. Later that day, an officer arrived to take my statement. Karen stayed beside me, her presence a quiet anchor as I recounted every detail from the moment Richard barked at me to the exact sensation of his shove and Samantha's laughter. The officer's expression didn't change much, but he asked precise follow-ups and noted every name. He assured me that with medical documentation and witness testimony, the case would carry weight. After he left, I felt both lighter and more exposed, as though speaking it out loud had peeled back a layer I'd been hiding under for years. That night, I lay awake long after the ward had gone quiet, the rhythmic beep of my monitor and the distant hiss of an oxygen machine keeping me company. My side throbbed, but beneath the pain was a new sensation anticipation. For the first time, I wasn't bracing for what Richard might do next. I was thinking about what I would do next. And that thought, fragile and flickering though it was, made the darkness feel less like a cage and more like a pause before something irreversible began. 2 days later, I was discharged with a packet of instructions, a small bag of medications, and Karen's steady arm guiding me toward her car in the hospital parking lot, the winter air biting at my cheeks. She had already moved some of her belongings into the guest room at her place for me, saying she wanted me close while I recovered. The drive was quiet at first, the hum of the heater filling the space, until she said softly, "You know they're going to spin this." My grip on the seatbelt tightened because I knew exactly what she meant. Richard would claim it was an accident, Samantha would insist she saw me trip, and my mother, if she chose to weigh in, would back whatever version kept the family image intact. Karen glanced at me, then back at the road. "That's why we get ahead of it." At her house, she settled me in with extra pillows and a blanket, setting my medications and water within reach. While I rested, she made calls to the police station to follow up on my report to Dr. Howard to confirm his statement was being filed, and to a friend of hers who worked in local media. I listened from the couch, the voices faint through the wall, my mind spinning with equal parts fear and relief. That evening, she sat down across from me with her laptop. "We need to document everything she said," opening a fresh file. Every incident, every witness, every piece of evidence. We spent hours going through my memories, starting with the earliest times Richard's control had turned physical, noting dates as best I could and marking patterns. It was exhausting dredging up years of moments I'd tried to bury, but each one we recorded felt like a small reclamation of power. The next morning, we went to the police station to sign additional statements and provide the printed medical records Karen had gathered. The officer handling my case assured me it was progressing and that Richard and Samantha would be contacted for their accounts. Hearing that made my stomach knot, imagining their reactions, but Karen squeezed my shoulder and said, "Let them talk. Lies don't erase bruises." That night we ate dinner in her kitchen, the warmth of the oven and the soft clink of cutlery making the room feel safe, in a way I'd almost forgotten was possible. I found myself breathing easier, the pain in my ribs still sharp, but the tension in my mind loosening. Before bed, Karen handed me an envelope. Inside was a copy of the formal police report stamped and signed. "This is the start," she said, "not the end." I went to sleep that night with the document on the nightstand beside me, its presence like a shield. For the first time in years, I felt like maybe the story was no longer entirely theirs to tell. 3 days later, Karen woke me early with coffee and a quiet but urgent look in her eyes, saying the local paper had picked up the story after her friend in media saw the police report and Dr. Howard's statement. By the time I sat up and reached for my phone, the headline was already circulating online: "Blunt and unavoidable, local man under investigation for assaulting daughter." It included no names beyond Richard's, but in a small town everyone knew the connections. My heart pounded as I scrolled, seeing a few cautious comments from people I recognized, others asking questions, and a handful expressing outrage. Karen told me this was good, that sunlight was the best disinfectant, but my mind raced through every possible retaliation Richard might attempt. Mid-morning, my phone rang from a blocked number, and I let it go to voicemail, listening later to his voice dripping with controlled fury, calling me dramatic, ungrateful, and warning that I was tearing the family apart. Samantha's voice chimed in at the end, mocking me for needing outsiders to fight my battles. I replayed it once, then handed the phone to Karen, who copied the message to a secure file and sent it to the officer. That afternoon, Dr. Howard called personally to tell me he had also been contacted by investigators and had reaffirmed his account in detail, noting the visible bruising and my difficulty breathing when I arrived. His calm, factual tone steadied me. Over the next 2 days, a slow shift happened. A neighbor Karen barely knew dropped off a casserole and murmured that she believed me. A former classmate messaged on social media saying she remembered seeing bruises on me years ago and had always suspected something. The validation was foreign and overwhelming. Then, one evening, the police called to inform me that Richard had been formally charged and a protective order was in place prohibiting him from contacting me directly or indirectly. I hung up and stared at Karen, the weight of it taking a moment to register. "He can't come near me," I said, almost to myself. She nodded and smiled faintly. The next morning, Samantha posted a cryptic status online about betrayal and lies, and though I knew it was aimed at me, I didn't respond. For once, silence felt stronger than any argument. Karen and I spent the day assembling the final pieces for the case photos, witness statements, and copies of every medical note, readying for the court date. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized that the fear that had been my constant companion was starting to loosen its grip. There was still a trial ahead, still the risk of seeing them in person, but something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was reclaiming my life step by deliberate step, and knowing that when I walked into that courtroom, I wouldn't be walking in alone. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and paper, the kind of scent that seeps into your clothes and lingers as Karen and I walked through the metal detector and into the echoing hallway. My ribs ached from the cold air outside and from the tension that had settled in my body, but I kept my head high. We found our seats near the front, the prosecutor giving me a reassuring nod as he organized his files. When Richard entered, flanked by his attorney, he scanned the room and his eyes landed on me, his expression twisting into something between disdain and disbelief, as if my presence here was an act of betrayal rather than a pursuit of justice. Samantha followed behind, her smirk faint, but pointed like she thought she knew how this would end. The judge entered, and the proceedings began, the formality of each phrase and movement both calming and nerve-wracking. The prosecutor started with Dr. Howard's testimony, his voice steady as he described my injuries, the difficulty I had breathing, and the immediate medical evidence that pointed to blunt force trauma. Karen testified next, detailing the night of the incident, her voice unwavering even under cross-examination when Richard's lawyer tried to suggest I had exaggerated. Then it was my turn. Standing felt like carrying a weight up a steep hill, but I faced the courtroom and recounted every moment, from the sharp command of "shut up" to the searing pain that spread through my ribs to Samantha's laughter echoing in my ears. I kept my eyes on the judge, not on Richard, and when I finished, the prosecutor displayed the photos of my bruises on the overhead screen. The silence that followed was heavy, almost physical. Richard's defense was weak, leaning on claims of a misunderstanding of family tension taken out of context, but each claim crumbled under the combined weight of medical records, police reports, and witness statements. The turning point came when the voicemail Richard and Samantha left was played in full, their voices dripping with cruelty, undermining every word of their defense. I saw the judge's expression harden. By the end of the day, after closing arguments, the judge delivered the verdict guilty of assault and violation of my rights, with sentencing to include jail time, mandatory counseling, and a fine to cover my medical expenses. A protective order would remain in place for 5 years. The gavel struck, and the sound reverberated through me like a release, a final severing of chains I'd worn for far too long. Richard was led away in handcuffs, his glare still searching for some way to make me feel small but failing. Samantha's face was pale. Her earlier smirk erased her phone clutched in her hand like it was the only solid thing left to hold on to. I stepped out into the cold air, each breath sharp but clean, Karen beside me. And for the first time in years, the weight on my chest felt lighter than the winter wind. In the weeks after the trial, the ripples of the verdict spread further than I had imagined, touching every corner of the small community where my family had once held an untouchable image. Richard's sentence was covered in the local paper with a headline that left no room for reinterpretation, naming him and the charges in stark black letters. People who had once smiled at him in the grocery store now avoided eye contact, and some crossed the street to keep their distance. His business partners quietly cut ties, citing reputational risk, and by the end of the month, his small contracting company had closed its doors, leaving behind a locked-up storefront and an auction notice. Samantha's life shifted too, her friends on social media dwindling as the voicemail recording spread beyond our town, reaching relatives in other states who had believed the family's perfect facade. Invitations she once flaunted disappeared, and whispers followed her at work until she took a sudden leave of absence. I heard through Karen that my mother retreated further into herself, refusing to answer questions from neighbors and spending most days inside the house with curtains drawn. None of this brought me joy exactly, but it brought balance, a leveling of the scales that had been tipped against me for so long. The protective order gave me a shield, and the conviction gave me ground to stand on, but the most tangible change was the absence of their voices in my daily life. I no longer jumped at the sound of my phone ringing, no longer scanned parking lots for their cars. One afternoon, as I sat in the cafe where Karen and I had first planned our strategy, the owner, a woman I'd known since childhood, came over and said simply, "I'm proud of you." It was a short sentence, but it carried more weight than any apology I might have hoped for from my family. Around town, the story became less about the scandal and more about the courage it took to speak out, which meant that people started telling me their own stories quietly over coffee or in the produce aisle. I began to understand that my fight had cracked open something bigger than just my own case. It had given others permission to confront their own hidden battles. That was a consequence my father never intended, but it was one I would carry forward as part of my own healing. Spring arrived with a quiet sense of renewal, and I decided it was time to close the loop in a way that left no doubt about my stance or my future. I used part of the compensation from the court to rent the old town hall for a community event, not as a celebration, but as a forum for survivors to share their stories. The day of the event, I stood at the front in a simple navy dress, ribs healed but posture stronger than ever, looking out at a crowd that included neighbors, teachers, and even a few reporters. Karen introduced me, and I began by telling my story from start to finish without softening any detail. I spoke about the night my father barked "shut up," about the pain that shot through my ribs, about my sister's laughter, and the cold clarity in the doctor's voice when he told me I needed to call the police. I described the trial, the verdict, and the aftermath, and then I shifted to why I was standing here now, to say that silence serves no one except those who thrive on it. The room was so still I could hear the hum of the old ceiling fan as I invited others to speak. One by one, people stepped forward, their voices shaking, at first then growing steadier as they shared their own truths. By the end of the evening, the room felt lighter, almost defiant in its collective strength. The next day, photos from the event circulated online, showing me standing tall, microphone in hand, with the caption, "Local woman turns personal tragedy into community action." Richard would see it from wherever he was serving his sentence, and Samantha would hear about it from someone who knew someone. That was the final message I wanted to send without ever speaking to them directly. I was no longer the daughter or sister defined by their cruelty. I was a person defined by my choices, my resilience, and my refusal to be erased. Walking home under the early spring stars, I felt the kind of peace that comes not from forgetting, but from facing everything head on and knowing you survived on your own terms.